Hello and welcome to the Blue Mountain Customer Lab. My name is Keith Kyle and I'm one of the regional sales managers who will be hosting today's lab on event schedules. For those of you who are joining us for this first time, we hold the Blue Mountain Customer Labs on the first Wednesday of every month to discuss a topic or feature in Blue Mountain RAM. Okay, so just a couple kind of housekeeping notes here. We welcome and encourage questions and comments throughout the call. There are two basic ways to do this, to participate. The first is to ask your question over the phone. We'll unmute the lines to do that. Use the GoToWebinar to raise your hand to ask a question over the phone. You'll hear an announcement saying you are unmuted, and then please let us know your first name and company. The second way, of course, is by submitting a question to the GoToWebinar questions panel. So these calls are meant to bring Blue Mountain RAM customers together and engage in ongoing conversations, learn about features, connect with fellow customers, and provide us, Blue Mountain, with feedback. The Blue Mountain Summit, as you can see on your screen, is our annual conference where you can enjoy conversations like these in person. We hope that you're able to join us this year for the summit, which will be held on October 2nd to the 5th in State College, Pennsylvania. At this year's summit, we will also be offering training on Blue Mountain RAM configuration as well as maintaining and updating reports. Both training tracks are limited to seats, which are filling up quickly. The reports training has about 8 seats remaining, so we encourage you to register soon as possible to get your spot, but also to qualify for the early registration discounts that are still in place. Registration is available on the summit website. And that early bird discount that I was mentioning does expire on the September 15th. Okay, so let's get to the topic at hand. We tried to put out a couple relevant poll questions to this topic. What I'm going to cover and focus on today is the event schedules. So I'm going to start by just reviewing in the application, of course, the relationship between assets, events, and schedules. Then we're going to kind of delve into date-based scheduling and wrap up with meter-based scheduling. So kind of back to our polls, we asked a couple questions that are relevant to this. And actually, I think I'll just wait to bring those up as we touch those areas. I think that might be a better place to do that. So let's, without further delay, kind of get started here. Again, feel free to ask questions here throughout. Raise your hand. This is really intended to be a back and forth dialogue with Blue Mountain and the customers. Okay, so let's start with a demo asset here. Look it up. Pull up this hot isostatic pressing vessel, so HIP vessel, against which I have a couple PMs that are scheduled against it to demonstrate the scheduling area. So just to recap before I go too deep into that, we have the asset or the equipment master records inside RAM, which has a one-to-many relationship with events. So your events are your calibration, your maintenance, activities that you put on a reoccurring frequency to come due. We have two types of those, shared versus private, and that was actually one of our poll questions. What percentage of the audience today are using shared? So 60% said they are indeed using shared events, and as for those that are using it are obviously aware that it is shared. So the idea is you set up one event that is exactly the same for 20 or 50 sets of like instruments, so you kind of streamline that process of maintaining that event and defining, what it is that needs done, since it may be exactly the same for each of those. Which brings us back now to schedules, and schedules are what tie the assets and events together, particularly since you have this concept of shared events. So the schedules themselves are considered in RAM part of the asset record. So once you attach a shared event, you assign a schedule to it. And so each of those are independent. Although the intervals may be the same, when the due date for 20 of those 50 hits may be completely different than the other set. So again, the schedule is considered part of the asset record. So back to our asset record here, under the view menu, we're going to look at schedules. And we're going to see I have a couple example schedules set up here to go through the feature set. The first one is a meter-based schedule. We're going to come back to that. We're going to rather start with the date-based schedule here, which are the next three that you see here. The first being a monthly, every month here. The annual hits on the 31st of this year, and then the semi-annual, which is already passed for this current year, is set to hit on June 30th. So this is a scheduling technique to, schedule an activity like a calibration or a PM that may have different tasks associated with it based on when it's done. The monthly may be more of just a simple check. The semi-annual may involve a few more tasks, and the annual might be a rebuild of the piece of equipment or just a more extensive activity. And that's why you would stagger the events like this. So let's just pick the first one, edit the schedule, right? And just ignore this for now. I'm going to actually go through each of these frequencies here to give you an understanding of what they mean. But before we do that, let's kind of go up to the top area here and look at the header level field. So this is actually telling me what assets associated with. The schedule calculation method, this is where you pick date versus meter-based scheduling. This is a date-based. And then the calculation source field here, so which is three options: due date, actual end date, or start date. The end date and the due date are the most commonly used. I think in our poll questions here, we had our distribution here. 42% said they generally schedule or recalculate the next due date based on the due date, while roughly 58% or almost 60% calculate based on the date it was done. So there's a variety out there. It's one of the reasons this is an option for how different organizations will schedule. That's what that's for. On the meter side, our meter-based usage ratio, roughly about 7% use meter-based scheduling. So there's not a lot that are using it, but we are going to cover the features so you understand what it can do, and if it's useful to you, it may be something to consider. Okay, the event name, that's just a read-only field that's pointing back to the event that this schedule is associated with. It just gives you the opportunity to tag it with a friendly name of what this calibration might be, or what this activity may involve. Scheduled person, this can be populated or left default. This kind of gets into the actual scheduling of the work. Some will choose to leave it blank, maybe associated with crews or groups, and assign it once the work is created, or some may wish to default a person that maybe 95% of the time does this work. That's really up to you.
So it looks like we have our first question here, and the question is there any problem with making all events shared as opposed to differentiating between shared and private?
The answer is no, really. You're free to do just that, and the benefit is you have less records to maintain. So let's say that you need to make a change to a shared event. You can make that change in one place. You have to have rights to do that naturally, and the system will tell you that you're making a change that may impact 50 instruments, but you can save that time and make that change. So you may revise the SOP that's associated with it, or change some kind of classification on the event. So there's no really drawback. You just have to understand the feature and whether or not it makes sense to set them up like that. Good question.
Oh, we have Chris raising his hand. Chris, we're going to unmute you. Do you want to go ahead and talk?
Mr. Kyle, is it?
Yes, hi Chris, how are you?
Good, how are you? Just
Good.
since you touched on the whole shared event topic, can you just elaborate a little bit on some caution regarding attaching a single MDT to multiple shared events?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I guess
and
the
the
best way
caution of that?
Okay. Probably a good way to answer that question will be, let's circle back and let's just choose this calibration event here. Just randomly choose one. And then active state, so I need to change it to inactive. And so this is a shared event. So actually, when I went in to edit this, you'll see this dialog come up. And it's going to tell you, you are about to modify a public event or a shared event, which really, it's the same thing, which will affect all of the assets that are using it. Okay? And you just acknowledge that fact. And you, at that point, you define it like you would any other event. And one of those things are referencing an SOP, or as Chris pointed out, choosing the measurement data template scenario. Okay? So measurement data templates, like shared events, are centrally managed records that you set up for the calibration scenario, and you can associate those with the shared event. Now, what this means is for this calibration scenario in this case, whatever assets are referencing this shared event, they will all be using this particular measurement scenario. So we're not really covering this area here. I just want to open it up and just remind you what that is. These are your nominal points and your tolerances, basically your calibration scenario. If you need to vary that, say one needs to be a 10-point calibration versus a 5-point or vice versa, then you're going to have to use either multiple shared events, or you can always use a private event, which is a one-to-one with one-to-one with the asset itself from the event perspective. Chris, did that answer your question? Are you still unmuted?
Yeah, no. I believe I'm still unmuted, and that did answer my question. I just wanted to again kind of reiterate that concern, because the same applies for work plan templates that you attach to shared events. If you ever make a change in that work plan template, you can possibly attach that same work plan template to multiple shared events, which then get attached to multiple assets. So it's just kind of doing a little due diligence on the front end before you change something to see really what you're impacting, how many events and how many assets.
Yes, absolutely. Yep. And again, this warning, we try to just warn you just to let you know, remind you of that fact when you go in to edit those. So it's a powerful feature, but just make sure you understand it when you're using it, and it'll hopefully save you some time. Thanks, Chris.
Thank you.
Okay, next question. With calculation source field set to due date, when does the scheduled due date advance to the next due date?
That's actually a good question. That is a function of the workflow that's assigned to the actual calibration or maintenance record. And there's two ways to have that done. There's a prompt that we can bring up upon save while you're in a given state. So let's say you're in the in-progress state and you save it. If you want the dialog to come up, as actually just follows the audit reason, that's one place to do it. Or we can actually automate it through the workflow to say when the work record transitions from review to closed, for example, automatically recalculate the due date. So we actually give you two options, and it's really, again, it's a function of the workflow and how you want that to be, how and when you want that to be updated. Okay. So a couple more points. This is your initial due date on the schedule that you set. Frequency and interval, we're going to come back to that because these are going to morph with each selection here, but these bottom sets of fields here will be the same. Reminder days, that's just a reminder from the due date. You can write a query around that. So it would be, instead of September 30th, next due date. Okay, yeah, that's going 5 days before what the next due date would be, which would be the next day. So if the due date is September 30th, at an interval of daily every day, the next due date would be October 1st. And then you could set this reminder date. Again, it's just a way to build queries around that schedules coming due type of query that you might build. We added this feature, I believe, in SR4, and it's effectively the ability to set an end date on that interval. Okay, so by default, and before we added this feature, the option was what you had to do to stop it would just be to clear out the due date itself. Okay, and that would be what you do. If you know at a certain date the work is going to end on this, then that's what this feature will allow you to do. I think some folks were tracking stability tests in the application, and this was pretty common, where a certain scheduled event would end on a certain date, and then you'd have different intervals throughout. Okay, so back to frequency, and this is really kind of where the guts, nuts and bolts here are for date-based scheduling. So daily, pretty straightforward, every day or every 3 days, whatever you set this interval to be, that's how this will calculate, and on and on. Monthly, same concept here. The interval field here kind of dictates what that is. If you want to set up a quarterly activity, what you do is use a monthly frequency every 3 months. And as you can see, the next due date calculated will be September 30th plus 3 months out. Monthly end of month, which is really just a variation of that same thing, but what we'll do is the date math to figure out that happens to be the 31st, which is the end of that calendar month, as opposed to just the 30th. Monthly specific days of the month. So this gets a little more interesting here. The interval piece is the same. Really, the days of the month, this is probably a lesser known feature in there, where you can actually explicitly say this is done on the 4th and the 17th of the month. Pretty random there. Okay, so what you'll see is that'll go ahead 1 month into October. It'll actually use the 4th as that start date and so forth. So and the next date calculated would be the 17th. So it's not it's been in our software actually since our legacy product, Calibration Manager, and many may not be aware of that, which is one of the reasons we're holding this webinar, to let you know, the customer lab, I should say, that it's there, and this is effectively how it works. And the month. Okay. And I believe that will, the last, if you check that, I believe that what that will do is include the last day of the month also with that combination. So you would have the 4th, 17th, and the 30th or the 31st. I believe that's how that's going to work. Monthly specific days of the week. Okay, so you have occurrences, the first, let's say you want to do the first Tuesday of every month, you can set it on that. It'll come due on that first Tuesday, and we'll figure out, what that happens to be. In this case, it's October 3rd, 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 4th, or again, the last Friday in the month, for example, would be that last option. Single. So this came along the way where customers wanted to set a due date activity, but when it's done once, it's complete. Okay, so that's exactly what happens. You set the due date as a single, and when that due date recalculation occurs, it is effectively clearing that out, so it won't come due again unless you come back in here and set that due date. Weekly here, so again, every 2 weeks, every 3 weeks, those are your options there. And really you're just modifying the interval. Weekly on specific days of the week. Okay, we covered, I think, monthly on specific days of the week, and here are weekly specific days of the week. yearly. Okay, you could accomplish this with a monthly 12 frequency, or simply do a yearly, or every 2 years to do that. So you might use this for an asset review, so that periodic review of your audit trails in a record, things like that, just reviewing the record as a whole. You're not going to do that on a too frequent a basis, but you want to set something up to remind you to do that every 2 years or 1 year, whatever that may be. So kind of useful for that. Also, annual requalifications are another common yearly schedule, and yearly specific months or days of the year. So this is actually what this particular event is scheduled as. I'll make sure, come back into it, and you're going to see this event, which is the monthly activity calibration in this example, but this could be a PM. This is done every month with the exception of June and December. So those are purposely not checked because this is where the semi-annual is going to hit, and this is where the annual activity is going to hit. Okay, question?
Oh, yeah, we have a question from Cindy. Cindy, we're going to unmute you, and you can go ahead and ask it.
Hi, Keith. It's Cindy calling from Canadian Blood Services. I have a question with regards to daylight savings time. I think I have the settings correct for it, but I just kind of want to double check. For the schedule, we're using the due date, and then the frequency we're using yearly on a specific day of the week, and then we're choosing the first Sunday of the month for October or November.
Okay. I can tell you that with the dates that we calculate in store, they're all in UTC time or GMT time when it's actually stamped and stored in the back end. All right, so we will, and then what is displayed at the site level, you have a local time zone that you set. In that case, it'll translate into whether it's what time zone you're in, and take into account the daylight savings there. So I believe that's going to be covered within that. It's pretty low level and technical. I don't have the 100% answer to that. I could probably get that for you, but I can tell you for sure that is, we track dates in UTC format on the back end, especially so when we go from site to site with our multi-site and global implementations, we're confident that what that data is that's common among all of them, even though a certain site may be 4 hours ahead of the other.
Great. Well, I don't know if maybe I wasn't clear, but we create a scheduled event for daylight savings time for equipment. So when it comes due to go check the equipment, a work order is generated, and they see that, okay, this needs to be looked at to make sure the time is correct on the equipment, not within RAM itself, though.
Oh, I see. Okay.
So we're trying to configure a schedule that will come up every, the first Sunday of every November and then the second Sunday of every March, so we can go and look at the equipment. So we're using monthly day of the week, specific day of the week. Yeah, that one there. And we've chose the interval as 12, so it's every.
And what was the first Tuesday or second? What day was it?
For November, it is the first Sunday.
Okay.
And we use the calculation source field as due date, because if it use the end date, it's whenever they finish the work. And that's how we've been setting it up.
Okay.
I just kind of wanted to get a confirmation if anybody else is setting the events up like this and if it's working for them.
Yeah, could we do a poll question on that? So okay, good question. And what we'll do, since we can't kind of unmute everybody, we'll just put up a quick ad hoc poll question on that. And let's say, ask it like this: how many are using the monthly specific days of the week? frequency.
Thanks.
Thank you. Appreciate that. Okay, we're almost there. I think what will happen is my screen will switch over to the poll questions here. It'll only take a second. So everybody click real quick if you're using this particular item, or I'm sorry, frequency. The vast majority, I would say, use monthly, quarterly, annual. They are the most common in the kind of the distribution scale. But these other frequency options are very useful for the example that Cindy just gave us. Okay, is the poll open? Okay, the poll should be open. And half of you voted. We're getting there, almost there. We're getting roughly about 23%, a little over 20% are using this frequency, and I venture to guess that probably means that group is using some of these other more advanced or specific frequency options. So that's good. And again, for those that are not using it, again, the purpose of today is to show you that it's there, and hopefully with the discussions here, give you some ideas of a way to get a little more out of the system. All right. So I have to share my screen again. Here we go. Good. Bear with us here. We're just trying to get my screen re-shown here. Okay, I think we're back online here. Good. Okay, so again, that's the date-based scheduling area. Again, I have in this particular scenario, I had 3 of those. So you can see I'm actually using 3 events that I put on different schedules. And again, the purpose of that is so you can vary procedures that are done on those different intervals. Okay? In many cases, you're going to have one calibration event that might be quarterly. That's kind of the most case, but this really covers that specific scenario, particularly in maintenance, so we often see that being necessary to have this kind of variation. Question?
Yeah, so this question is from a customer that's on SR3, and they said that they're unable to remove a schedule from an asset. Do the newer SRs allow you to do that? And then a follow-up question is also, our service release has enabled the dialog that opens up on an event record, save when in progress, and allows the technician to change the due date. You said it can be configured not to be enabled?
Yes, so the question there, best answered here, if we just open up a work record here, let's just pick a calibration record. Oh, there's no due date on that. Let me pick a better one. There, okay. So a couple questions were in there, and let's start with the due date. So by default, generally the due date is configured to be read-only on the work record side of things. And the reason that is that due date comes from an approved, signed off on, confirmed interval. So you want to make sure that when that comes over, in most cases, that is not modified. Okay, so you have an actual end date when you do it, which may ideally is before it, or it could be after the fact, and you may have to fill out an NCR or a justification of why that was overdue. But in the end, you have this due date that is, again, not changed necessarily on the work record, the work history. Now, there is the ability to configure it to enable this. So you might have maybe another status that might be a change status that may enable that, and maybe the way that some customers will prefer to handle it could be to change it to one of those statuses, change this, which would be captured in the audit trail, so you can still have the documentation that you changed it, and then sign for it, and then complete it. So you have, a different due date in that case, and then all of the background material around that. Most will have us, and that's one of the reasons why we default it to read-only. Most will prefer to have it set to be read-only. So the other question was around, I believe you're on SR3, and there's definitely been some enhancements in this area added since then. We're at SR5, and one of them along the way is the ability to clear out a due date based on a status change. If the single interval was added as well, which there's no workflow there, but once it's done, the due date is cleared out. So that's another way to clear out the due date. But we've also introduced in SR5 actually this feature as well, which is the ability to create when you add the work here, and before we added this middle one, we only had the choose event, which is generally your scheduled, or your demand, which is a purely demand-based activity. And what we found that many were using events for defined activities, but that they want to plan out and define what they are, but they don't want them really to be on the schedule. So a better way to handle that would be to use this demand event base. So all this will do is create a work record from that event without a schedule. So there won't be any due date from an interval or anything, and it won't impact in terms of recalculation of any intervals of this event if it in fact does have an interval. So again, it's a very specific way to add it for something to really get the benefit of the event that's defined what to do, but not to impact the due date.
So this is actually clarification. He said he was referring to changing the next due date once you've completed or saved the record.
Changing the next due date. So maybe let's do it like this. Let's just create an activity here and walk it through. Okay, before I do that, I need to reactivate this. Actually, no, I'm going to leave this as is, and I'm going to just choose a different asset that I believe should be activated and just do it quickly that way. Here, let's do this. Okay, this is a simple work order with a very simplified workflow rule, and that's open, close. Very simple stuff. It was a scheduled activity, so you can see this due date is disabled. And really what you really just need to do is say when it was done. Okay, you'll see once this, well, let's save it first. So the next due date is empty at this point. I'm going to save it. Completed work. Okay, the dialog that you'll see here next after the audit reason is that dialog to recalculate the due date. Again, I mentioned earlier, we can automate this, so make sure it just happens behind the scenes on the status change, or we have the dialog come up here, which gives you the opportunity to roll it forward or don't roll it forward. So as you can see, I can modify this. There's actually an admin setting that you can put a more or less a band around this to say you don't change it, more than 3 days forward or in the back or in reverse, or you set it to 0, which case it would remain the same. And when you commit that, it's going to use that interval information that we just looked at, recalculate what that next due date is. So the schedule is rolled forward, and historical record here, which is what we're looking at, has all the information, what the original due date is and what the next due date was calculated at the time. So this tells you, if you were to look at this a year from now, in hindsight there, you could infer what the interval is. Well, at least what the space between that next one should be, which is 6 months. All right, so let's go back to, so that's date-based scheduling. So we kind of covered most of that there. We'll have some questions here at the end. You can come back if you think of something, but I want to try to move along here and just cover meter-based scheduling here while we have some time. So these are date-based. This is a meter-based schedule. So if you look at this, the scheduling dialog is going to look a little different. In our poll, it looks like roughly 7% out of those attending today used this feature. So it's not widely used, but it's there. And again, we just want to cover it to show you how it's used. And if you look at the top header fields, most of them are the same, except I chose meter-based. So in that case, it's going to come due based on meter readings that you enter into the system that are associated with the asset. So these fields really look identical. The due date is left blank. So what's going to happen is when the meter threshold is breached, we're going to set the due date, and then it'll come due just like your date-based scheduled activities would come due. It's just going to set the due date to that day or plus or minus days around that date that the meter was breached. So frequency, there are 2 options. Single, so that's just what it describes. You just, once the meter threshold is breached, just set the due date once and then be done with it until someone comes in here and resets some things. The reoccurring is kind of the most interesting one here. This is where you say every 50 of whatever the meter happens to be, whatever the units you're talking about. So there is a meter associated with this called production runs, and the units of that meter are in run. So this could be runs of a system or production runs that you're using a certain device out there. Could be days, could be a variety of things. What we're able to do is say every 50, make this activity come due. So the current reading is 40. There's no offset in here, so the effective is 40. And the rollover date, most meters have some type of rollover date to say, when it's going to reset to 0. So as long as that's recorded on the meter itself, we'll know when to do that math to reset it when you're getting over that threshold. And so the threshold happens to be 50. So once we get to this first 50, it's going to set it to become due. And as you can see, the future threshold, which is the analogy to next due date, is 100, or 50 plus every 50. Okay, and then lead days would be, and if the threshold was breached today and this was 1, then it would come due tomorrow. So the due date would be September 7th, and that's exactly what we'll show here in just a second. That is the meter schedule and what it looks like when you set it up from a scheduling standpoint. Now let's go back and let's actually take a meter reading. So with our asset that we're working with here, I look under meters, so I can see this asset has a production run meter associated with it. And you have to add a meter with an asset before you'll even see that meter-based reading option in the scheduling. If you don't have any of these set up, then you've never seen that option that I just showed you, because you can't get to it until you set up a meter. So this particular asset, my vessel here, has a production runs meter tied to it. Right here, this is that meter record itself. Let's just take a quick look at it. Got a name, units, the rollover amount, which could be a very high value in most cases, the general location of where this meter is, and also kind of a reverse trace to say what are the assets that I am referenced on as a meter, what are the events that use me potentially for scheduling, and then this is your reading log. So this will just be like an audit trail with the readings that are added against this meter. So let's take a quick meter reading. You can do it out here. Take the reading. And let's just get over that 50 threshold. Let's just say it's been 60 runs. Okay. Now if we go back, now that we've taken that reading, if I go back and I look at my schedule on my asset, all of a sudden I'm going to see a due date that's set. So this is my usage due date, my usage schedule here. Let's open it up, look at it, and now you see that due date is set, which is today plus the lead day of 1. So tomorrow, September 7th, this will come due. And at that point, it functions just like a date-based scheduled event. You know, if your batch work job runs, it'll pick it up tomorrow or the next day, add it into your backlog, and then you'll work that. It'll have a due date, you know, on it, stamped on it, and you'll work it off like the rest of the activities. And if it is reoccurring and the next time it breaches, in this case, 100, due date will be set again. Or if it's single, it'll be a one-time activity. So just a note on that area, on meters, you know, certainly I see it as a kind of an integration point. So, you know, if you, to use it, obviously just directly in the application, you need to come in and make sure you take these readings on a periodic basis and keep them updated. But we've had some customers express interest in potentially integrating this area with other systems out there that may collect this information and could pass this to our system to update it. In fact, we've had some basic integrations that have been done over the years with that, which makes it a little more timely and effective to use. You know, if those meters need to be updated in a timely manner for them to be effective, obviously. So again, we kind of see that as an integration point of our system with other applications out there that may have that information. Questions? There's got to be questions on that. So I think we have one.
So Crystal, we're going to go ahead and unmute you. You can ask your question.
Hi, I have, so is the only option for the meter reads is runs? Can you also do hours?
Yes, absolutely. So let's just set up a new meter here. You define what these are, my meter, and you define what those units are. Okay, if this rolls over every million hours, you set that there. And once you define this meter, then you can associate with the asset and then use it for scheduling. And of course, you'll need to keep that updated.
Right. Okay, awesome. Thank you.
Come back here, take a reading. Here I can say, okay, this was, let's just do an initial reading of 45 hours in this case. Offset value of 0. And that'll record that meter reading against that. Okay, so one quick note on offset value. It's been a while since I explained this one, but I just want to just quickly touch on that. You might switch in and out a meter, okay, at various points in time. It breaks or whatever. So the offset value allows you to adjust effectively what that effective reading, no pun intended, would be. So you can imagine if you swap in a meter, it's going to start at 0, whatever it starts at. So you may need to set an offset to make sure that effective reading is, at 75 instead of 0 or 20 in that case. And that allows that effective reading to ever increase, and when it hits its next threshold, on whatever events are using it to schedule, it'll trigger those to come due. Question?
Yep, actually, we did get a question in here. Can you explain that the unit of measure has no impact to the count of a meter? Is it just a text identifier on the unit, and then that it doesn't impact the reading in any way? Can you confirm that or talk about that a little more?
Yeah, it's just a textual indicator to say this is the units that you're recording that meter in. So it's nothing more than that. Okay, that wraps things up for today. We'll just take a few minutes here if there's any other questions on the topic. Again, event-based scheduling, or event scheduling, I should say, a feature that everybody uses to some extent. Hopefully we were able to show you some areas that are not maybe as widely used out there. Question?
Yep, we have one from Crystal. Crystal, you're unmuted if you'd like to ask your question.
Thank you. So this one's on private events. Are you able to do a batch update on a private, multiple private events? Since I don't assign my units to shared, I could have the same private event for multiple units. Again, either the work plan template or the MDT template might be different for each of them, but could I essentially do a batch update if I have those rights to do so?
Yes, you should be able to do that. Like other batch updates with these types of records, you have to use it on a record type specific query. My all events, I can't do that because there's a mixture of different record types and the fields don't line up, which is why the batch update feature only works on a record type specific query. So whether they're shared or private, you can still use the batch update on them, and then use it. This is just the standard dialogue here for batch update of events.
Okay. And then I just had one more question. If I update an MDT or work plan template, would that update all the events that have that attached to it?
Yes, yes. So that's just like the shared event is a reference to the asset of that shared event. The MDT is the same concept to the event. So if you have a shared event with 50 private events, when you update that shared event, when you update that MDT, all 50 of those private events will have that update reflected in them. Just the same way if you had it with one shared event, one MDT, that one shared event would be updated then, and then conversely, or on down the chain, all 60 assets that are using that shared event would have that change reflected with them.
Okay, perfect. Thank you so much.
You're welcome. Okay, great questions. We've used about 50 minutes of our time, which is a good healthy amount. We don't want to go too much over time here. If there's anything that you think of after the fact, please email us. I'll reach out to your RSM. He or she may be able to answer your questions for sure. Reach out to our marketing team. Again, we appreciate your attendance here today. And is there any other closing notes you'd like to add to it? Okay. All right. So that's That's it. Again, the first Wednesday of every month is when this is going to be held. So we'll hopefully see the folks on the line the first Wednesday of October here coming up.
And I'm not sure that overlaps with our
Actually, yeah.
customer conference, so we're working on perhaps rescheduling that to a different time, but we'll keep you all posted via email.
Yeah, I knew I was going to slip up on that. But yeah, our summit coincides with that, so we may push it back or skip it. We'll see how that worked out. But following that, we'll certainly have one in November. One more question?
Chris, we're going to unmute you. Go ahead.
Did I just happen to hear Drexel in the background?
You did. You snuck in here on me.
That's okay.
How are
That's
you,
great.
Chris?
Actually, good, Drexel. Can you give me a shout sometime this afternoon if you have time?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, I appreciate it.
Okay, thanks everybody. Have a great day, and we'll see you next month. Thank you.